This is the Atari 8-bit podcast.
They had goats grazing on our property, and he killed one of their goats. He slaughtered it. The owner of the goat came on the property and wanted to be compensated for it.
I'm Kevin Savitz. On this interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast, we take a trip to Ireland and to the coin-op side of Atari. Kevin Hayes was controller of Atari Irerland Ltd. In 1978, then became manufacturing director there. Later, he moved to California, where he was VP of Manufacturing for Atari Games, then Vice President of Operations. This interview was recorded December 7th, 2015. Go back to before the beginning. Tell me how you got hired by Atari.
Yeah, I was in I was in my mid-20s. I had worked out of college for Price Waterhouse, the accounting firm, and I was hired as the controller in the summer of 1978. Atari were setting up a coin-operated manufacturing plant in Tipperary in Ireland, and I hired on in August of 78 as the controller. There were 3 employees, there were 4 employees at that stage. Gil Williams, the guy who'd come over, Gil was the vice president of manufacturing. He'd come over to start the plant up, and we had a couple of engineers and maybe one other American technician. And the business started there in August of 78, and it was pretty low key at that stage. The games business was in a lull. The coin-op games business was sort of in a lull, and shortly after that, it sort of all kind of boomed again. The business obviously had started in 72, 73 in California, and the background, they'd been bought by Warner in 76, and they previously had the coin-op games had been manufactured various ways in Europe, mainly in France, in some sort of joint venture with a French company, and they decided to sort of do it by themselves in 78. So that's where I kind of started, Kevin.
Okay, great. So as controller, you're doing financial stuff?
I set up the financial systems and whatever like that, and a year later we had, say, the following summer, August of 79 or June, July of 79, we had maybe, 40, 50 employees. I don't really recall. And we had a modest little business going. But then in late 79, sort of Space Invaders by Taito arrived, and that kind of sort of gave the business, at least in Europe, a big shot in the arm. And we came up with Asteroid sometime after that. And in late 79, early 1980, and the business went from a sort of a $6 million a year business to a $40 million dollars a year business in 1 year.
Wow.
And at that stage, I should say is also the Gil Williams, the guy who started the business up, just went back to California, and I took over for him a year after I joined the company.
And that's when you became managing director?
I was the managing director, correct, of what was called Atari Irerland Ltd, which was essentially a coin-op manufacturing company. And we exported it to mainly Germany and the UK, but all over Europe. Okay.
Nice. So did you put together the coin-op machines from nothing?
Yeah, we basically got the brains of the machines in from California. We didn't do any printed circuit board manufacturing. The volumes weren't enough for us to bother with that, so we had those things shipped into Ireland. The printed circuit boards, custom boards that were made. These were all custom design boards, and they were made by Atari in Silicon Valley. And then we built the wooden cabinets and the wiring harnesses and all the metal and all that stuff, and put it together in a box and shipped it out. And that's really what we did, and we did that. I was involved with that business until 1984 when I came to the United States, then to work for Atari.
Wow. All right. So
But it was a kind of a flaming business in a sense. We went from $6 million the first year to $40 million to 30 odd to 28. It planed off in the early 80s and very quickly.
All right, so you're managing director for 5 years. Tell me.
6 years. 5 years. Excuse me. Yes, 79 to 84. Yeah.
Okay. So tell me a story or two about that. So tell me about interesting things that happened, problems you had to solve.
Do you want do you want kind of ridiculous ones first? Maybe?
Sure. Whatever.
Colorful ones.
Sure.
The standard colorful one we do is the fame, and I'm not proud of this in retrospect. I gotta say, but it has to be told and whatever. We had in Ireland, you got a quote a problem with, and in fact, the New York Times did an article on it there relatively recently. What were then called people in Ireland called the traveling people, also referred to as itinerants or tinkers. But these are sort of nomadic people that don't have a fixed place in Ireland, and they move around and occupy marginal land, if you like, and live there, and generally speaking are not accepted by the locals, if you like. They often referred to also as gypsies, but they're not strictly Romanies in the sense of the word gypsy is usually applied. In any case,
people, right? So they're not technically Romanies, but they are.
They're the Irish equivalent. They're often referred to in Ireland as gypsies also.
Okay.
There are a number of them. They're looked down by the local, what they call the local settled population, in other words, the average Joe, you and me, because they're kind of untidy and there's supposedly crime associated with them. Anyway, get to the story. And I am inclined to go off on tangents like this, but we had sometime after we were there, I think about 80, 81, we had a bunch of them come and settle on our kind of near our property and kind of right on the edges of our factory and whatever like that. And they had goats grazing on our property, and we had a chap at the time, actually, he was an American, and he took it on himself to as he sort of fight back against these people, and essentially he killed one of their goats. He slaughtered it, and I was in this kind of farcical situation then with these. The owner of the goat came on the property and wanted to be compensated for it. So I ended up paying him and made a deal with him to pay him, I think, at the time. So I'm going to say $30, $40, $50, something like that. But then he said he wanted extra because the goat was in child. And my friend, this all seems maybe it's a little bit macabre, but my friend had a butcher friend, and they slaughtered the goat, and he was eating goat burgers for some time afterwards.
No.
That is actually a true story, and that was meant to intimidate these people, but they just saw it as a business opportunity. They sold the goat for probably more than it was worth to us, essentially. But that was just to keep it all quiet and whatever. And, the business was we didn't really have a lot of problems there running that business. The escalating the production, because the demand went, we went from 6 million, we went from shipping, we had a plan to ship maybe 1,000 games a year, something like that, 20 games. It was a small volume production thing, and we ended up doing more like 20,000 a year in the second year, so it was a big deal from our point of view, the way the thing sort of escalated, but we managed with it, and we shipped the stuff out. And our big hits during that period were Asteroids. Obviously was a very big hit for us, a game called Missile Command. Battle Zone was a big one for us, although that was the beginning of kind of overproduction. The market started going south a little bit in 82, and we didn't kind of manage it very well for a while. And that's kind of, it's all in the distant past, Kevin, I got to say. It's so long ago.
So it sounds like the popular games there were pretty much the popular games in the United States.
Yeah, the only game, for example, actually the game that when Space Invaders came out and was a very big hit everywhere, I think more so in Europe than it was in the United States, relatively speaking. But we had a game in the United States called Atari Football. They didn't call it. They didn't want to pay for the NFL brand, but it was a trackball operated game played.
Right, several people can play at once.
Exactly. Yeah. So we made a soccer version of that, which didn't really work very well. Soccer isn't isn't really amenable to that kind of, planned plays type of thing that NFL is. So that the translation of, if you like, the NFL, the football game to soccer, as a video game, we're using that same sort of principle of a trackball and everything, really didn't work very well. And we made a lot of them and sold them off very cheap in the end. Lost a lot of money on them.
All right. Any more stories? I mean, I asked for a story, and you told me about goats, so that was a great start.
I know, and that's not what you're expecting.
No.
Gosh, I'm
I was expecting stories about inventory problems, or we couldn't get the.
Well, we had
right.
one time we had actually, just going back to that soccer game. That was very early on in our process, and maybe towards the middle of 1979, just after I'd taken over, and we had a trade show to show this soccer game. This I think we called it Atari Soccer. I don't really remember now, but. To make prototypes for a trade show in London, we ended up having a kind of rather bizarre problem. The Pope was visiting Ireland. I forget which Pope it was, but this was 79, so you can probably check it. And back then Ireland was still in its extremely kind of Catholic phase, and he attracted huge crowds. But he did a mass appearance in Limerick, which is very near Tipperary, and we had a real problem with employees. We couldn't get anyone to put together these games for the show because everyone wanted to take the day off. It was just a big national holiday for several days. As the Pope, he had Ireland's a population of. Well, the whole island is 6.5 million, probably 6 million at that time, and in the south it was more like something less than 4 million. But for example, I'll give you the Pope in Dublin, which was his biggest appearance, had 1 million people. I can't remember how many he had in Limerick, but he did 3 or 4 masses in Ireland, and all our employees pretty much wanted to go. And it ended up myself and a couple of other people sort of working through several nights, like 24 hours, to put these games together, and really not knowing what we were doing. But we managed to get them out and whatever, because we literally couldn't get anyone to work for us for a day or two because of this mass thing. Yeah. But that was an exception. Mostly everything worked pretty well. To be honest with you, I should have put more thought into this and come up with some stories for you. I wasn't sure what way this interview was going to go, and I guess I'm not at my best at 9 o'clock on Monday mornings. But
no, we're doing great. So Tipperary was chosen as a manufacturing
as a manufacturing plant by other American companies set up around the same time. For instance, a year later, Apple set up in Cork and is still there and going really strong. But of course, Atari is long gone from Tipperary now. But we ended up with a couple of hundred people at peak, including the factory in Tipperary, and then a wood manufacturing, a cabinet manufacturing place we had in a town called Ardfinnan, which was about 20 miles away. We bought that from our supplier.
So you were shipping the stuff out? I mean, you're an island, so were you shipping stuff out on barges? Or?
Yeah, okay. So it was kind of, if you look at it like this, it was kind of, we saw it this way. We were in the southwest of Ireland in Tipperary. It's a sort of by Irish standards, it's relatively far from the sea. Tipperary is, and if you look at a map, you'd maybe appreciate it better. But basically, our electronics came into a fairly big airport by Irish standards, into Shannon Airport on the west coast of Ireland. And then we built the games in Tipperary, and then we shipped them out through Waterford, which is famous for Waterford glass, but that for us was a container port that had good links to mainland Europe. We could ship into Holland, Germany, UK, all that kind of thing out of there. So it was, and that was east of us, if you like. So, for instance, west of us was Shannon, about, I don't know, an hour away, something like that, an hour and a half away through Limerick. The electronics would come in through there. We'd put it all together in Tipperary and then ship it out east of us through Waterford. And it was a screwdriver job. It was a pretty basic operation. There wasn't a lot of. We did no R&D. We did no electronics manufacturing per se. We bought in the metal. We got the metal in the sense of the mainly the control panels, that kind of thing, and some of the specialized controls. For instance, like trackballs or something like that, that the volumes that we would do in Ireland to manufacture them wouldn't justify it. We shipped that from California also. And in the in the early days when the production sort of ramped up really early, we even shipped in some knockdown cabinets because we literally couldn't get the cabinets fast enough because the demand for asteroids when it took off so fast.
What do you mean knockdown cabinets?
Well, knockdown cabinets in the sense of, the cabinets would be flat packed, if you like. If you go to IKEA and you buy a piece of furniture, if you think about it that way. Except it wasn't as slick as that. In other words, the sides of the cabinets and the front of the piece of the cabinet or whatever like that would be all flattened out, and we'd put it together in Tipperary. That was only for a few months in 80, when we just literally couldn't get enough volume in Ireland fast enough. But we got over that.
All right.
Yep.
Should we move on to when you left there and went to the United States?
If you want to, sure.
Well, are we done? Are we done in Ireland? Are there more?
I can't. The business. That was managing the business on the upside. Managing the business on the downside was tougher in a way because, we'd hired all these people and the business kind of we'd gone to a couple of hundred people. I can't remember exactly. More than 200 anyway. And then the coin-op business was its heyday. The really big boom, at least from our point of view, was that sort of late 79 to, I'm going to say, mid 82 period. So it was a relatively short period of time, about 2.5 years. And then we had to scale it all downwards. And that was all difficult, laying people off in a rural area where there weren't a lot of other opportunities. But, that's what we did, and we had to do that. And that was kind of tough. And then for myself personally, the business still continued, but it was back to more like the levels that we had originally seen it at, maybe a bit bigger than that. We'd gone from being a $6 million business to a $40 million business, back to being maybe a $12 to $15 million business. Annual sales I'm talking about. We'd had a few more successes. I think maybe I didn't mention Centipede was a game for us into, I think, 82, 83. And then in 83 and 84, we got into manufacturing the laser disc business games.
Oh, yeah.
We did a deal with a company called Cinematronics. They bought out a game called, Dragon's Lair. Yeah, right. Dragon's Lair was the big laser disc game down in San Diego, and myself and our sales guy Shane Breaks went over to San Diego and negotiated a deal to do that product, to buy the license for the product for Europe, essentially, and manufacture it in Tipperary. So we did that game, and we did a game called Space Ace, which is one of theirs, and then Atari came out with, it was based on that
Firefox.
Firefox, yeah, the Clint Eastwood thing. We did that, but all that stuff was, it never felt right. It didn't feel like that was really going to be anything, and it wasn't. It was a flash in the pan for a year or two, and it went away. And big losses and whatever, kind of disasters. So I came over to Atari then in mid '84, in June of 1984, and I came over to. I'd scaled back Tipperary, and in California they decided. They were going through the same problems, maybe a little bit on a slightly later time scale than us, maybe 6 months behind us. Their market started to tank. And I was brought over to close the factory in California, in Silicon Valley, and relocate to, would you believe, El Paso, Texas.
Lucky you.
Yeah.
It's kind of the opposite of Ireland, right?
Well, and certainly in terms of rain and dryness and all this kind of stuff. So this was my job, and it was supposed to be for 6 months. And I literally came in towards the end of June 1984, and I came in on a Thursday. And sometime, I can't remember exactly, but it was within a few days, and I'm going to say the following Monday, Warner announced the sale of the company to the Trammell, the Commodore people, Jack Trammell and his sons and everything. So, but they didn't buy the coin-op part of the business. They didn't want it, and Warner held on to it, and it was total chaos. And in all of that, I'm proud to say, or not, I don't know, I'm proud to say, I've been in lots of parts of Texas, but to this day, I've never been to El Paso, Texas, even though that's what I came to do. Yeah, I'm here 32 years later, and it's one of my unfulfilled ambitions. And in America is to go to El Paso, Texas.
Oh, you were supposed to go for your job.
I was supposed to go.
And then
I literally came into California, and I was supposed to start doing this job of moving this plant to El Paso, but that all got torn up in the chaos of the sale and everything. Because it was a kind of a very badly managed, chaotic kind of panic selling by Warner, and it was just very poorly handled, in my opinion. But these things all usually are, I guess. So I never got down there at all, and we decided to, instead of moving to El Paso, Texas, the economics didn't justify it anymore, because back then it was associated with, they already had consumer manufacturing, VCS manufacturing down there, and one of those Maquiadora type deals. And we were going to sort of play off that, if you like. But now we were different companies, the coin-op part and the consumer part. So we didn't do that. And we ended up doing a kind of a scaled-down manufacturing in California, in Silicon Valley, in Milpitas. Okay. And we never went to El Paso, Texas. And then I worked there for several more years. The company was bought by Namco, a Japanese company, bought a chunk of it with Warner, and I stayed with them until 1990 when I moved on. And that's my life with Atari. I was there 12 years, if you like, from 78 to 90. Wow. 6 years in Ireland and 6 years in the United States.
So you were VP of manufacturing at first, and then you became VP of operations.
And I was VP of operations, and then I was very briefly VP of finance also, with my accounting background. It was that chaotic, we were doing all sorts of different things.
Right.
Yeah.
So what was, I don't know, what was different about being in the United States? I mean, I realized it was a different time, and the games were more advanced and that sort of thing. A lot had changed, but can you give me something that was different about doing it in the United States versus doing the job in Ireland?
It wasn't a whole lot different. I mean, it was a wider, from a manufacturing point of view, there was more to it, because we built the boards, and you got to remember the printed circuit boards. You remember this was still a small scale business, and one of the problems I always saw with moving to El Paso was the fact that you were going to be so far removed from the engineering, which was going to remain in California. And I knew from the little bit that I'd seen of it before, and I certainly realized it very quickly after I got there, that this stuff didn't lend itself to engineering being remote from manufacturing, given the volumes that we did. You just needed to be there, because these were custom-made boards. They weren't sort of standardized PCs or they weren't a standardized product. They varied. Everyone was a different set of hardware, and there were changes and last minute changes and all that kind of thing, and it just didn't lend itself to remoteness and sort of a long supply chain, if you like. And the business that the manufacturing business that we did there was the highest value added was, of course, making the printed circuit boards and doing the electronics for the games, and that was the major difference, sort of running that business, managing that business. But in the end, it was about manufacturing, so it ultimately wasn't that different. And, we did the wood, and we did the harnesses, and we did the metal and all that type of thing, just as exactly like we did in Tipperary, maybe with slightly greater volumes. And we continued to supply Tipperary with the electronics, with the printed circuit boards from California, from Milpitas. And that's kind of it.
Okay. Why did you leave Atari?
I moved on. I got the company sort of split in two in 1990. The Atari had gone into the consumer business. They'd formed a subsidiary. This was now called Atari Games Inc., and it was a joint venture of, I feel like, Namco and Time Warner. But in 1990, the company separated. There was disagreements among the two owners, the joint venture partners, if you like, over the strategy of going into the consumer business with this subsidiary called Tengen, and they did it without a license from Nintendo. I don't know if you've covered this stuff or not, but the Tengen, which is a subsidiary of Atari Games Inc., got into lawsuits with Nintendo over doing cartridges for the Nintendo NES, I guess it was at the time, without a license, and that became a big lawsuit. And the Namco didn't like the fact that Atari Games, which they roughly owned half of it, I can't remember the exact proportions, 50-50 kind of thing, with Time Warner. They didn't like that this had happened, and they ended up taking the operating part of the business, operating meaning in the sense of running amusement arcades, that kind of thing, which they had got into in 1988. They took that with them, and the Atari Games kept the manufacturing business, and I went with the Namco business into the operating business. I already had been in the operating business from about 88, and this, when I say operating, that's as distinct from being the VP of operations, which tends to be more a manufacturing role. I was the operating guy. In other words, I ran the arcades, and I went to work for Namco in there to kind of crank up this game operating business in the United States. I mean, coin-operated arcade games in freestanding in arcades, mainly in shopping malls. Yeah. And I worked for Namco then from 1990 to 2008 in that business.
Well, and today
and also started up a coin-operated manufacturing business with Namco, which was in competition with Atari's coin-operated business, my old bosses. Yeah. And
today you're president of Namco's Cybertainment?
That's old news. No, I've been retired since 2008. Okay. I was president of Namco's Cybertainment. Was what ultimately was the was the name we gave. I can't remember, in maybe 94, 92, 93, 94 for the operating business. That was the kind of umbrella company for all the operating businesses. We bought the biggest small arcade business called Aladdin's Castle in 92, 93. And we bought some others. And, we ended up with we were the largest arcade operator in the United States. We had 450 arcades at peak, I think, mainly in regional shopping centers throughout the United States. We were in 40-odd states, so that kind of thing. We had 20,000 plus games and a couple of thousand employees. And I was there until 2008 when I retired.
All right.
And that's kind of it.
All right. So I'm curious. I realize you've been retired for a few years, but I think you'll have an opinion. Is there a future? What is the future of arcade games, of arcades in the United States?
Well, you'll appreciate I'm not up to date with it, and increasingly less up to date with it. Okay. I still get the trade magazines and stuff, but often I don't even read them anymore. But my sense is that it's scaled down to being the kind of business that it used to be in prior to the big boom of the late 70s. The kind of the video game boom, if you like. It's become much more of less of a video game business and more of what they call redemption games. Games that give tickets and give you prizes, that kind of thing. Okay, some of those are video based, but mostly they're electromechanical games. So it's a much smaller business. That mall arcade business has essentially disappeared, and arcade games they're in I guess you could call they're in several different kind of ways. And although decreasingly they're less in theater lobbies. They used to be a lot in theater lobbies. There's less of them now, I notice, and they're kind of getting a bit older. Far few manufacturers. There's only really Namco, a Japanese manufacturer, still does them, my old company, and a couple of US companies. But there's really not a lot of demand for them. There's a whole bunch of small redemption game manufacturers in the United States. And, that's a pretty decent business, but a smallish business, if you like. Of course, there's the Dave and Buster's of this world, and there's these big pizza places that do big arcades with it, and there's a lot of what they call the family entertainment center business, which is a fancy word for an arcade with maybe miniature golf and go-karts and some other things with it, if you like. But it's a much, much smaller business than it was in its heyday of, I characterize the boom of the business as being the early 80s. Okay, there were some other times after that, the Street Fighter era in the early 90s, and Namco had good runs and then Sega with big games like big games in the sense, and we used to call them simulators, with Alpine Racer, for example. It was a game that Namco did, that type of game, that you had very unique controls that differentiated itself significantly from what you could do in the home environment. But the video game business, the arcade business, from the advent of the Sony PlayStation in 93, 94. Really, that was the kind of, to me, that was the beginning of the end, because then at that stage, the graphics and the power of the home game was better than what could be done with the coin-op business and on an economic basis, to the point where a couple of years later, the engines, the electronics for the coin-op arcade games was the Sony PlayStation and the equivalent from Sega, etc. So there was a kind of an inflection point there where the whole thing changed, and there's still a business there, but honestly, I'm just not up to date with it anymore. I don't know the numbers, but I know that the company that I was involved with, it is much smaller. It was called Namco. You said Namco Cybertainment Inc. It's called, I think they changed the name back to Namco Entertainment Inc. It's a smaller business than when I left it 8 years ago, because they've had to close a lot of the mall arcades.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
Okay.
Yeah. Is there anything I should have asked you that I haven't?
Probably, but I can't think of what it is.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. I appreciate your time.
I hope you got something out of it, Kevin.
This is perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.